The president's decision to go to 50 miles, we believe at the time, was based upon not information, but the lack thereof. Okay, there was not good information. You had 6 units there. They were basically trying to get control of not just what's in the reactor core, but also the spent fuel pools. And given the lack of information, given the devastation on the infrastructure due to the earthquake and tsunami, not Fukushima, we believe the president's decision was to be conservative and to move Americans out early and move them out over a larger area. And that caused some problems in Japan, but probably from a U.S. standpoint was the right thing for the president to do. When you look at the 90-day report, the other thing is they basically say that they see no impact on new plant licensing, that anything that comes out of Fukushima can be factored into new plant licensing as those proceedings go forward. They also don't say anything about stopping current licensing for either license renewal for the existing plants or power uprates. And in effect, we've had, I think, 9 licenses renewed since Fukushima, and there's been 2 power uprates approved since Fukushima. So the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is continuing to do its reviews. Now, they do in their report call for 12 orders, 7 proposed rulemaking, and then 15 recommendations, a lot of which affect the NRC staff themselves as opposed to going outside of the NRC. When we looked at their report, and to be honest, they did a good job in a concentrated period with very few people, and the industry was doing something very similar because we were looking at everything we could learn from Fukushima. The Institute of Nuclear Power Operations has been very diligently trying to recreate the timeline of the events at Fukushima so we can understand not just what happened, but why it happened. And it's still difficult to get all the information you want. I mean, they're very busy over at the site trying to recover and stabilize it. So while there's a lot of information coming out, it's still difficult to get answers to a lot of the why questions, but TEPCO and the Japanese government are working to try and help us on that. When we looked at the 90-day report, what I would say is the topics they identified, the issues they identified, we believe are probably right on. They're the same issues we're identifying. You'd like to make sure that you have more coping time. You got to make sure you can deal with floods. Make sure that the stuff we did to have diesel-driven pumps after the 9/11 accident actually can deal with multiple units. One of the lessons learned that's come out of Fukushima that's clear to us on the industry side is you got to think multiple units differently than we did before Fukushima and prepare for stuff like that in a different way than maybe we had been thinking beforehand. What we don't agree with right now is in a lot of places the task force jumped from an area that we think is the right area and what we think might have happened to the answer on how you solve it. And one of the things you do in life, and you certainly do at nuclear plants, is you really want to make sure that you understand why something happened. Because then you can address the root cause. And you can actually address it as opposed to what I think happened and why it happened and get it wrong. And a good example that I would use on that is containment venting. Okay, we know that at Fukushima, they tried to vent the hydrogen from the containments. We know that they had hydrogen explosions in the buildings so that the venting process didn't work right. We know that, there's no question. We don't know why it didn't work right. We don't know whether they waited too long. We don't know whether their procedures caused them to wait too long. We don't know whether they did it exactly right and the system was damaged in the earthquake and didn't perform its duties right, and that's why it leaked into the building and they had the explosion. So understanding the whys help us address the root cause of what we need to do to fix it. And that's one of the key things right now that we're seeing is a need for the NRC staff, the industry, and other stakeholders to truly, really review this in a lot more depth than we currently have gotten out of the task force activity. The other thing, the task force report, for those of you that have the diligence to read the whole thing, it looks at the regulatory process and calls for some significant changes in the way NRC regulates. That may be appropriate, may not be appropriate, but it's not a Fukushima issue. We want focus on the Fukushima lessons learned, which has to come out of what happened in Japan, and apply it here. If you want to make wholesale changes on regulatory process, we ought to look at that in a separate path with probably a lot of diligence and a lot of good looks, but it's not a Fukushima issue. So that's one of the other areas where we would say we need to bring focus to the right things we should be looking at, both from the regulators' perspective and from the industry's perspective, and to be honest, from all other stakeholders' perspectives. Okay. Where are we right now on this? We're, as an industry, going to engage, which is what we always do with the NRC and, to be honest, with other stakeholders and internally. There's an awful lot of effort going on, not just within NEI, but with IMPO, to look at the right stuff we should be doing at the plants, and we're going to continue to do that. I sent a letter into the Commission following the 90-day report, which basically said what I told you. We agree with many of the topics. We think there are things in the near term that make sense, but we need to focus on those, and that we think that what should be done is we should do this in a disciplined way going forward. That sounds to some like maybe we're trying to delay stuff. Believe me, we don't want to delay anything that we think right now would enhance safety at the plants. But what we don't want to do is do stuff that doesn't enhance safety or has unintended consequences because we haven't thought it out. And we also don't want to divert operations to areas that maybe are important to safety but not as important as something else they're trying to get done right now, and put it in the right priority. So the chairman of the NRC has called for trying to resolve all of the issues within a 5-year time frame, which would include rulemakings, which do take 2 or 3 years at NRC. I believe, and the industry believes, that 5 years is a reasonable time frame. Don't drag it on if you don't have to. It may, in some cases, take more than 5 years if I have to do things in an outage, and an outage isn't scheduled to year 6. But right now, what we would say is we need to go forward in a very disciplined way, doing the short-term stuff that has the biggest safety impact, and then putting everything into a disciplined process to get the rest of the stuff evaluated and then ultimately implemented if it's appropriate. I know one of the things this community is always interested in is what will this cost? And I'm sure there's going to be companies that, because they work with you, will try to give you cost. I don't know how you cost this out right now, because we're not sure what makes the most sense. Most of what we're seeing as near-term activities is not terribly expensive, because it's enhancing what we already do. Where it's buying equipment like what we do for diesel-driven pumps, it's not very expensive equipment. And in a severe accident mode, you want to have agility and flexibility as opposed to very rigid things that you're doing at the plant. You want to be able to do things depending upon how the accident evolves to get water where you want to in the best way. So we're looking at more flexibility in what you'd implement, and it's enhancing the kinds of things that we currently think about. Okay, the commission, the next step when you look at this 90-day report, the commission needs to vote on the disposition of the 90-day report. Two commissioners have voted already, Commissioners Magwood and Savinicki. Their votes are public. In essence, their votes are calling for go forward in a disciplined way, identify things that may make sense to do and make them priority, and take steps as a regulator on those, but go forward in a disciplined way. So they're not voting on, quote, the 12 orders, do this order, don't do that order. They're voting on a process that the NRC staff should implement to actually identify what you really should be imposing and what mechanism you use to impose it. Is it a rulemaking? Could it be an order? Should it be some other mechanism that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has that can impose requirements on the plants? We're expecting, or we're hoping, that all the commissioners would vote by the end of this week, because the staff needs direction from the commission to go forward. And again, from our standpoint, going forward in the right way is very important, both from a safety standpoint and from making sure we don't have burdens at the site in the wrong way. So we would like the commission to give direction to the staff in a reasonably short period of time, and we're hoping they would all vote this week. You can see that there's a staff briefing, a public stakeholder meeting on July 28th. They'll talk about their task force report. It's the task force talking about it. Unless the commission has acted, they can't tell you what they're going to do with it. So we need the commission to act. There's a hearing before Congress on the 2nd of August. We think that's an impetus for the Commission to act, because certainly members of Congress are going to want to know, what are you telling the staff to do? So we're expecting that might be an impetus for the Commission to act. I should mention that in political space, what we're seeing is, in general, and I mean in general being like 95%, very responsible and measured response by both Republicans and Democrats in House and Senate. And to be honest, we saw that during the whole Fukushima accident as it evolved. We spent a lot of time briefing up there, trying to provide them information, just like we were trying to provide information to you and others. And there was a lot of interest, but there was really no, hysterical reaction to what was going on. They were trying to learn how bad was it in Japan, and they were trying to learn what might it mean here. And again, the big message that's come out of the task force report is the current plants are safely operating, not that there aren't things that we could do to make them even safer. So I think I would look for the next few weeks to get something coming out as direction from the Commission, and then they will start their process for basically taking the 90-day report, which is kind of the first, and it's a very important step, but the first step in their process for taking the Fukushima lessons learned and imposing them as requirements or not requirements on our current fleet. All right. Meanwhile, and I mentioned, we're seeing power uprates, we're seeing license renewal go forward, and that's because they're in very systematic, rigorous processes. And if there's lessons from Fukushima, which in cases of power uprates and license renewal, I'm not quite sure what we'll get on that, they would be imposed as required as time goes by to make sure that all the plants are safe. Because it doesn't matter if my license was renewed last year, last week, or next year. If there's something that we need to do at the plants, the NRC makes sure we do it. So it's a real-time deal with significant new information that the NRC would impose. We're also seeing new plant activities go forward. We still expect, and we've seen nothing to cause us not to suspect this, that the licenses for the Vogel station and for the Summer station, Vogel's expecting it late this year, Summer's expecting it early next year. We still think that's the path that they're on. The mandatory hearings are still scheduled by the NRC to occur later this year, and the design certifications and everything else are going through. So we don't see an impact right now. If there are things from Fukushima that would affect the new plant deployment, that'll get factored in as they go down the road, building the plant before they operate the plant. The other thing I should mention is that one of the good things about the plants going forward at Vogel and Summer is they have what you've heard us call passive safety systems, which is basically water coming down from gravity as opposed to being pumped by pumps and motors where I need AC power. So at those sites, if they had a similar event driven by anything, whether it's an earthquake and a tsunami or a flood or something else, and they actually lost power, they have about 4 days worth of cooling to the core in the spent fuel pools by gravity. So they have on the order of 4 days to recover power while they're still cooling everything. And that's part of the new designs that we're looking to build here and elsewhere.